Hi, my name is Lisa Dominguez. I'm the Director of Clinical Services at the Center for Adoption Support and Education. Thank you so much for joining us for Safe at School, Support for Adoptive Families by Educators. So before we start, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about CASE. CASE was founded in 1998, and we exclusively work with the foster care and adoption community. If you live in the DC metropolitan area, we provide direct service both for pre- and post-adopt families, individual, group, and family counseling, as well as consultations. We do crisis intervention and support, and much of what we deal with is working with the schools. It's one of the main issues that parents bring to us as an area of concern. We also do training both locally, nationally, and internationally on a number of topics related to adoptive and foster families, and our workshops and presentations are for families, educators, and professionals. We have a number of publications that you can see at the bottom of your screen, and our website has all of the information about how to order our publications as well as other resources that are available in addition to our in-demand webinars and our live monthly webinars that we offer. And I will share that information again at the end of our presentation. So why are we talking about school? As I said, one of the things I hear the most from the families with who I work is that school is a stressor for their children, not only academically, but socially and emotionally. Sometimes it is as a result of some learning challenges. Sometimes it's a result of emotional issues that are interfering with school. And some of it is just the day-to-day of interacting with peers and staff. We know that most kids really do fairly well with their adoption story until the ages of about 6 or 8. And as awareness of adoption impacts them, and as others begin to question their adoptive status, their learning is more likely to be impacted by the emotional experience of adoption. And this is from David Brzezinski, who is a national expert in the field of adoption. And what does that mean? I think what it means is that at the time that most of our kids are starting formal schooling, ages of 6 to 8, they are starting to struggle or understand or grapple with their adoption story, perhaps in different ways, as they're making some cognitive and developmental shifts. And this is true for their peers as well. Peers may have more questions, may have more curiosity, and kids then within the school setting are having to field these questions and comments. And that can cause a lot of stress for our children. So what do we hope to accomplish today? What we hope to accomplish is to learn what educators need to know about the adopted child. We're going to discuss some strategies for communicating with school staff. We're going to share ways to advocate for what your child needs to be successful at school. And again, I want to stress the importance of thinking about success at school, not only from an academic standpoint, but from a social and emotional standpoint as well. The social and emotional lives of our children are so shaped by their peer interactions and just their time at school, and can really be impacted for our adoptees in the learning environment. And finally, identify strategies for creating an adoption-sensitive school for all students. So I want to start with some basics, and this is communicating with school staff. And when I talk with parents and with kids, they often really struggle with communicating, either because there are some barriers to communication or because they're not sure what should be communicated, how it should be communicated, and to whom at the school it should be communicated. So what are some of the potential barriers? Often parents worry about how the child will be perceived. They don't want their child to be labeled. They don't want their child to be singled out. And part of that is fear around some of the myths and misperceptions around adoption, which we'll talk about later in the presentation. Another potential barrier is that they feel like the school will not be responsive to their concerns or to minimize their concerns, or have had that experience in the past. Another potential barrier, and this really becomes more of an issue as children get older is that your child has asked you not to share information with the school. And I think this is a really important issue to address and to think about. We really advocate for our kids to be in charge of their story and to feel empowered to share what they want to share with who they want to share it with. And this can be really tricky as children get older and are feeling very protective of their story. Kids don't want to feel different in any way. And we want our children to be able to advocate for themselves as well. So before sharing anything with your child's school, especially if your child is older in middle school or in high school, I really encourage you to sit down and talk with your child about why you think it's important to share, who you're going to be sharing this information with, what information you'll be sharing, and what role, if any, they'd like to take in these conversations. We really want our kids to feel empowered to be able to share their stories and to feel some ownership around their stories. The other issue that I think is really important to think about before talking with school staff is what should be shared. You may want to share that your child is adopted, but that doesn't mean you need to share the child's whole story, especially if that story involves some early trauma or some very sensitive things that may not be necessary for the school staff to know. Who should I talk to? And this can be tricky, and this might change from year to year in terms of who at the school is the best person for you to talk to. You shouldn't assume that information about your child will transfer from year to year. There are some teachers who may be much more open and responsive to this information and you have a good relationship with and you can talk directly with them. In other cases, it might be pulling in the school teacher as well as the school counselor if there are some ways you think the counselor may be able to support the child's classroom and the child, him or herself. And depending on what the issues and concerns are, you may need to also talk with the school administration. So really thinking about who you're talking to and what you're hoping to accomplish. And that speaks to this final point. It's also really important to think about why you want the school staff to have the information. And to be very clear when you're sharing the information, how you want that to be kept confidential, how you want that information to be used within the school environment so that a child isn't being singled out in the classroom or that a teacher or staff person isn't sharing something about the child's story without the child's permission. When communicating with school staff, parents often don't want their kids to feel singled out or stigmatized, and this is the biggest reason that they share with me often as to why they don't talk with school staff. And as I said previously, you don't always have to tell the child's whole story, and be clear when you are sharing parts of their story why you are sharing that your child is adopted and what are some of the reasons why you thought it might be important for a school staff member to have this information. And as I said as well previously, you need to consider your child's age as this will impact your role. Older children really need to be involved in this process if they want to be, and their wishes need to be respected when they can. And if mom and dad or mom or child doesn't really see eye to eye on this, to really have a conversation about the importance, why the parent feels it's important to share information and what the child's concerns are about having that information shared. So I want to just take a moment now to think about your child at school and to think about kind of his or her world within the classroom and school community. So for children who are not familiar with adoption, and even adoptees themselves, adoption is really confusing. Many times kids have a very basic understanding when they're younger of what it means to be adopted, but as they get older, and as I said earlier, their social emotional development changes, their cognitive development increases, they're able to think about adoption in a very different way. And it's very confusing for many kids, especially since many kids are getting their information from the media, which we're going to talk about in a minute. So when it's confusing, it often generates questions. And that in and of itself is not a bad thing, but it means that our kids are often having to field questions and comments because people are confused and trying to figure out what this whole adoption thing really means. It can also be frightening for our kids. For someone who's not adopted, the idea of not living with his or her birth parent can be frightening. The idea that someone may live with a birth parent and then not be able to live with them for any reason can be frightening. And this can lead to the confusion, and this can fuel some of the questions that our kids have to field within the school environment. It also involves sadness. Unfortunately, adoption only happens because of loss, and there are often some very tough things that our kids have in their past that is part of their story. And this creates sadness for them, and this creates sadness for their friends as they're trying to explain their story. So where do our kids learn about adoption, and what do they learn? For those peers of your children who are not adopted, oftentimes they learn about it in the media. They learn about it in movies. They learn about it through TV. They learn about it through casual conversations. Adoption is everywhere in the media, and obviously as an adoption professional, I'm very aware of that, but I think adoptive parents are also very tuned in to the fact that there's a lot of messages being shown in the media, some of which are positive, and some of which are not positive, and some of which really perpetuate myths and misconceptions about adoption. So many of the peers that your children are going to school with may not have a good understanding about adoption, or may really buy into some of the myths around adoption. And this can create a lot of challenges for your kids and in the school environment. As I said, you're in the grocery store. Adoption is everywhere. It's on the cover of People magazine. It's in the books that our kids are reading. It's in their movies. And what do they learn? Again, is it portrayed in a way as a positive thing in the media? Sometimes. Is it portrayed in a negative way? But all of these things fuel all of our perceptions about adoption. And so it's important to realize that a lot of our kids are dealing with other children, staff who don't have good information or have limited information. Who are their role models? Are we talking about the fact that there are some famous adoptees? Are we talking about Dave Thomas, who started the Wendy's restaurants? Are we talking about Faith Hill and Steve Jobs? Are we talking about Superman? And how are these touch points ways within the school community that educators can make adoption more accessible for all kids? So there are a lot of factors that impact an adopted child in their world at school, and many of them are very individual. Obviously, their age impacts what they're going to be dealing with at school, not only their chronological age, but their social emotional age, their adoption story, whether they're part of a transracial family, whether they look different from their parents, whether they're in a school community where they are the only adoptee or one of very few adoptees, their own temperament, where they are in the process of integrating or understanding or accepting their adoption story. Those are some of the major things. We're going to talk a little bit more specifically about some factors that impact all of our kids in different ways. So as I mentioned, number one, a child's perception of him or herself as an adoptee, as well as his or her unique strengths and vulnerabilities. Again, every child is different in terms of where they are and how they feel about themselves as an adoptee, how that impacts their sense of self-esteem and self-worth. We know for many kids who are adopted, they feel less than because they were not parented by their birth parents, and this can really carry over. So for children who are really struggling with some of those issues, trying to negotiate and navigate some of the comments and questions can feel very intrusive to them at school and can be very triggering for them. Number two, peers' perception of adoptive families and children who join their families through adoption. Again, what is the perception? Do their peers know other adoptive families? Is it seen as something that's normal, something that's common, or is it something that's really unique? And so a child really doesn't have a point of reference for understanding what an adoptive family is. Number three, non-adopted children commonly seek out adoptees in an effort to comprehend adoption on any level. So again, if you have a lot of non-adopted children in the school community, they may seek out your child to try to understand adoption. Oftentimes they'll do it with no malintent. They're just curious and want information. Unfortunately, there are times where the fact that someone's identified as adopted makes them a target for bullying. So again, these issues all impact how your child might be struggling at school. Number 4, bias and misinformation in media. Children's common sources of facts are reflected in attitudes towards adoptees. We've already touched on this. So children often have a lot of misinformation, which could lead to, again, a negative perception of adoption, a perception that an adoptee wasn't wanted or an adoptee is bad, and so it can make children the target of bullying. Unfortunately, it's not only the peers at school who often have misinformation, but it's staff as well. They may not have had personal experience in their own childhoods growing up with adoptees. It may not be part of what they know or are familiar with, and unfortunately, they often need some information as well, and that's what we're going to talk about a little bit later in the presentation, about how to educate our educators so that they can help educate our children and help really mediate and intervene when there's teasing or bullying or comments or questions that are happening within the classroom. Number 5, outdated misinformation and overly dramatic stories continue to provide the foundation for how a new generation of children view adoption. And again, this is really stressing that same point of really helping to get appropriate information into the hands of our kids and educators. Everyday references to adoption which reflect society's knowledge or bias regarding aspects of adoption. So what's going on in the news? Is it being talked about? Is there a story that's really present and is creating some negativity around adoption or some bias around adoption? That's going to impact what goes on for your kid at school. Number 7, perception of others in the school community about adoptive families, especially those that are transcultural or transracial. And I know I've made this point before, but thinking about where your child goes to school, is there a diversity in terms of the types of families, not only foster and adoptive families, but transracial families, transcultural families, LGBT families? How diverse is the school community? Often a more diverse community can be more positive for a child. If there's less diversity, it creates other barriers. And number 8, perception and knowledge of school personnel about adoption. So again, we focused a lot on the peers so far, but teachers and other school staff may need our help in addressing some of their own biases or myths around adoption, and really need some help around how their thoughts and feelings about adoption and adoptive families are communicated within the school community. Teachers may have preconceived notions about adoption based on personal experiences or based on the fact that they haven't had a personal connection to adoption. Educators often do not have basic information to help them address issues as they arise. They need to understand what a children's understanding about adoption is at different levels of development. They need help understanding normative emotions around the adoptive experience. They need help understanding some of the common challenges that adoptees face. They need appropriate language and ideas for educating all children and really infusing adoption into the curriculum. So you need to ask yourself, what happens in your child's school? How can children learn about adoption? What is the school's role in helping children learn? Will they see or hear something that is about adoption while at school? Will they be put on the spot to talk about his or her adoption story? And again, looping back to what we talked to earlier, parents often really worry about this, and that's one of the main reasons they choose not to talk to the school, because they don't want their child to be singled out or put on the spot. So in having these conversations with educators, it's really important to drive that point home. Will teachers find ways to increase knowledge and comfort with adoption even if they are not aware there are adopted foster children in that school? How do we put this on the map for our educators? That even if you think or are not aware that there are adopted or foster children in your school community, how do you infuse this into the day-to-day language? Many of the books that our kids read have adoptive themes. How do they integrate this? And will adoptive and foster children feel equal in family status? Unfortunately, there are some environments where being adopted or being a foster child feels like a lesser status. Is this being communicated to your child either directly or indirectly within the school community? So we know that educators can be and are a wonderful resource for helping all children feel positive about adoption as a way to build families, but we can't assume that this is going to necessarily happen without some advocacy on our part as parents and some advocacy by our kids themselves. How can teachers help? Teachers are often the single most important influence outside the home. They are trusted to know accurate information. They're valued by our children for their advice and opinions. So this can go either way. If they're talking about adoption in a positive way, that's really valued. If they're talking about it in a negative way, that's really impactful for our kids. They're trained to provide information at an appropriate level of understanding, and they're aware of how to help children make the information relevant to themselves. We want to make this information accessible to kids, and it needs to be presented in a way that won't overwhelm them, in a way that they can understand. And teachers are knowledgeable about individual personalities and learning styles that will impact understanding. So we want to see teachers as our allies. So as we're thinking about how to influence the school and how to influence and talk with the teachers and educators, I want us to think about the 5 A's. And there's some overlap among all of them, but I think it's a nice frame for thinking about how to talk with teachers, how to approach the school, and some of the key points that we want to make. So the 5 A's are acceptance, accuracy, assignments, assistance, and advocacy. And we're going to look at each of those a little bit more closely now. So the first A is acceptance. We want to ask school personnel to normalize adoption and adoptive families by demonstrating both personal and social acceptance of adoption as one way to build families. And again, oftentimes educators will say, well, of course, we are accepting of this. But I think in our conversations, we want to really challenge our educators to think about, well, how is this being done? And does it need, or can it be done more directly so that those messages are being received by our kids? So teachers need to know what you believe matters to your kids. Your unconscious stereotypes, assumptions will be communicated to the class. They need to know that all families are real families and all parents are real parents, and that the language they use in their classrooms matters. One of the things I hear time and time again from both parents and kids in the work that I do is intrusive questions or comments that have the word real. Is that your real mom? Is that your real brother? Is that your real sister? Why didn't your real parents keep you? So again, having our teachers be tuned into the fact that using words like real are stigmatizing for our kids, so that they're tuned into this, so that they can listen for that, and that they know how to intervene if they hear kids using that language, or if they themselves in the past have used that language. How can they shift how they say things? So this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but some of the most common things that we hear, and really can be important in helping your educators think about respectful adoption language and how the language they use really impacts how people perceive adoption and adoptees, and that the word that they use really, really matters. As I said, we don't want to hear things like real parents or natural parents. I say to parents and kids all the time, are there any fake parents? There are no fake parents. There are different types of parents. There are birth parents, there are foster parents. So we really want to make sure that that language isn't being used in our classrooms, on our playgrounds, at all as we're talking about adoption. We want to use birth parents or first parents or other parents and helping explain adoption. We want to talk about my child. Your child is your child, whether that child came to you by birth or through adoption. We want to talk about relatives, not blood relatives. We can be relatives without being connected by blood. We want to talk about making an adoption plan. We don't want to talk about kids being given away or surrendered. We want to talk about kids being placed for adoption, not being put up for adoption or not kept. These words are very, very powerful and really make a difference to how our kids think about their own story and think about themselves, as well as the way they feel others feel about their story. We need to talk about a child in need of adoption as opposed to a hard-to-place child. and that we are an adoptive family, not that my children are adopted. So some additional recommendations for teachers. At the preschool level, they can simply mention the words adoption or adopted as you talk about babies and families. You can role play getting ready for the arrival of an adopted child. Often in preschool, lots of siblings are being born, and there's a lot of talk about that in the classroom. We need to also honor if siblings are coming into a family through adoption. We've got some great resources on our website with a bibliography that has some recommendations for books that can be in the classroom. Again, normalizing adoption as a way to form a family and explaining it in a very developmentally appropriate way for preschool children. And early elementary, talking about different kinds of families. And just as I mentioned, if a baby's born into a family, add that some children join their families through adoption. And consider a class activity to celebrate National Adoption Awareness Month. And it would be great if the schools were doing this regardless of whether they had any adoptees in their classroom that year. Again, of just raising awareness and having the opportunity to talk about adoption in a positive way. Accuracy. So accuracy is so important. So it's not just that we want adoption to be talked about, but we want adoption to be talked about in an accurate way. Unfortunately, there's a lot of misinformation and a lot of myths around adoption, not only by our students' peers, but also with adults. It's always amazing to me when I tell people what I do who don't have a lot of experience personally with adoptive families, some of the misinformation or the myths that they have about how adoption comes to be and what it's really about. So we want to gently suggest that school personnel educate students about adoption and adoptive families by providing accurate information at the appropriate time and in an interesting way. And this often really means that they themselves need to be educated around adoption. And again, there are resources on our bibliography that you can share with the schools as a way to help promote some of that. So in order to promote accuracy, we want our educators to include information about adoption and lessons related to the different kinds of families, genetics, history, literature. Many of our kids' books have themes of adoption. We want them to be talking about National Adoption Month. We want them to be addressing misperceptions or myths that are coming up in the media and maybe the subject of discussion in their classroom. And we want them to highlight well-known, successful adoptees. Teachers need to know that it's important to have books and resources in their classrooms that represent different cultures and different families. And here are some more specific recommendations. Again, at the preschool level, encouraging them to read stories that include adoption. Ensure that pictures and books in the classroom reflect diversity. Same thing in early elementary school. And correct potential confusion when the word adoption is used in connection with animals, etc. So oftentimes, younger kids know adoption in terms of they adopted their pet or they see a sign, adopt a highway. And so it's really important to help kids understand the difference between rescuing an animal or sponsoring a highway and what the adoption process is. Assignments. So I really want to spend some time on this one because this is one of the biggest things that I hear from parents. And I think one of the biggest reasons why parents should proactively talk with their students' teachers at the beginning of the year so that you're able to talk about potential assignments throughout the year that may be difficult or challenging for your child. Teachers often really don't think about it. It's not on their radar in terms of why an assignment may or may not be challenging for an adoptee. And often I have found are very open to guidance and really need some guidance in understanding why a particular assignment may be very difficult or triggering for a child who is adopted. So we want to ask our teachers to construct curricula that ensure inclusion of students in adoptive families. So what does that mean? Teachers should know that some assignments may be challenging for adopted students. Not everyone has a baby picture or can easily construct a family tree. They need to understand that if kids are being asked to do an oral presentation, that this may be challenging because it may involve having to talk about things that they're not willing to share with their classroom peers. So let's talk about some specific assignments that really cause our kids some trouble. baby pictures. So the assignment is to bring in a baby picture. This is sometimes used to post on a bulletin board, or if your child is the star of the week. When children are older, especially when they're seniors in high school, the yearbook often wants a baby picture to put in the yearbook. And this can be really triggering for our kids who joined our families when they were older, and we might not have a baby picture of them. So we can ask our teachers to say that children can bring in a photo of when they were younger or draw a picture of themselves. And again, we don't want this exception to be made just for our child, but that is the instruction for the entire classroom. Again, we don't want our child to have a different assignment from the other children that really singles them out. So in rethinking an assignment that may involve a baby picture, ask them to make that more inclusive. Bring in a picture of when you were younger, or draw a picture, so that it's not excluding students who don't have a baby picture. And as a parent, you want to let your child know that you wish you had a photo of them when they were younger and that you were sure that they were a beautiful baby. You want to really validate the feelings that are being stirred up for them when these assignments are given, because sometimes it can be very triggering for our kids. Family tree is another really challenging assignment. Children are asked to draw a family tree either as a literal tree with branches or in diagram form. This is often done in elementary school. Why it's challenging? The format may not accommodate birth, foster, and adoptive relatives. And if a child wants to put those relationships on their family tree, they may be faced with, well, I want to put it on there, but I don't want the other kids to know that I'm adopted. I don't want to share this with the class. So again, this can be challenging. So alternatives for teachers, offering formats that show roots as well as branches, or instead of a tree, ask students to create a family forest or a neighborhood of houses, and ask the kids to include whoever they consider to be family. So to, again, make it more inclusive, not giving our kids a specific exception, but giving lots of options to the whole class so that everyone can feel like they can complete the assignment, and making sharing the assignment in front of the class optional so that all kids have the opportunity to opt out of that, not just our adoptees who may not want this to be shared with the class. If your child does want to share this with the class, it's important to talk with them about what questions or comments might be brought up as a result of them sharing this information with their peers, so that they can practice answering or practice saying, I don't want to answer that question. So that's another thing that's really important. If a child does choose to share this information within the classroom, that's wonderful. You just want to help them be prepared for what questions or comments they might get when they're doing their presentation. Charting genetic traits, another tricky assignment for our kids. They're often asked to diagram or write about the presence of a particular trait in their child's family, such as eye or hair color. When you're adopted, this is an impossible task. And it may raise a lot of feelings about not knowing who you look like or from where you came. Alternatives for teachers, that you can ask that they study genetics in insects or plants, or use historical examples such as the prevalence of an inherited disease in the royal family, or using some other way to get at the same information. And again, giving this option to all of the students, not just to our students. You can help your child identify friends or a biologically related family group, such as grandparents or cousins, on which to base a genetic chart. So even if it's not their own genetic chart, they can maybe do a genetic chart for their adoptive family, for their adoptive parents, and they can do the assignment in that way. So recommendations for teachers. In middle and high school, there's a way also to proactively insert adoption into the curriculum, as well as being aware and being sensitive to certain assignments which may be challenging for some of their students. So middle and high school teachers can suggest adoption as a theme for essay or journal writing. They can introduce family history assignments with sensitivity to other types of families, discuss adoption in science class in connection with genetic studies, and talk about inherited traits versus acquired. And talk about families formed by adoption in their sex education and health classes, and use positive adoption language. Assistance. So one of the things that we really want to make sure our kids feel is that they don't need to navigate these relationships by themselves. They don't need to navigate and negotiate these questions or comments without assistance from their teachers. We want them to know that they're going to have support, that the teachers are not going to turn a blind eye to comments or questions about a child's adoption story, and that the teacher is going to be there to intervene if the child needs help. So we recommend that school personnel identify appropriate boundaries and language about adoption and adoptive families. And this goes back to helping to educate our educators around language that might feel unkind or triggering to our kids. Teachers should know that intrusive questions about adoption are the norm for most school-age kids, that they need to have it on their radar. They need to be aware of what is being said and have a zero-tolerance policy for bullying of any kind regarding family difference, whether it's a foster family, an adoptive family, a transracial family, a single-parent family, an LGBT family. And again, this needs to be true for all of our families as well as for our adoptive families. It's really important that our teachers know that children born outside of the U.S. are not and should not be looked to as the experts on the culture and language of their birth countries. If your child's teacher is doing a unit on China and your daughter is an adoptee from China, they should not be singled out to talk about China. They should not be looked to as experts on their culture and language. If the child wants to share something, it needs to be their choice, and that needs to be communicated to our teachers. We want our teachers to help our students feel empowered to share or not share what they want regarding their adoption story. We want them to never share something about a child's story without his or her permission. We want to educate everyone that a person's adoption story is private and that the adoptee, him or herself, is in charge of their story. For example, we would want to let adopted children know that they will support them if questions or comments get out of hand. They're likely to assume that they must handle adoption on their own, and this can create feelings of shame. They need to know that their staff are going to help them with this. So recommendations for teachers and things for them to think about. For the later elementary school, we know, and this only increases over time as our kids get older, children want to fit in. They don't want to be singled out for being adopted or different in any way. This is a time when kids are often very private about their adoption stories. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to feel different. And we need teachers to really help support this and be aware of that. In middle and high school, if a student says, I would never place a child for adoption, we want them to intervene and to educate about adoption being as a loving choice in forming a family. So the fifth A is advocacy, and advocacy really connects to all of the previous A's and everything that we've talked about. And that really, as you're in your role as parent, how can you advocate for your child? How can you encourage and support your child in advocating for him or herself? And you want to clarify that your school will take action to support students and adoptive families if comments or questions about adoption or adoptive families become invasive, that there's zero tolerance. We really need to be advocates for that within the school community and not just assume that that's going to be the case. So again, we've talked about this again, but when you're advocating within the school environment, this is, I think, one of the most important things as a parent. And again, for the kids themselves to be able to advocate and insist upon within the school environment. So what have we learned? We've learned that this can be a daunting and confusing issue. We've learned that we can't assume that our educators know what our kids need or that they themselves have good information around positive adoption language or about adoption. And that educators can and should be advocates for adopted children and help them feel more comfortable about their families. The only way that they can do that is with your help. Again, we want to be sensitive to the needs of our kids, and we don't want our kids to feel like we're sharing information that feels private to them, but we also want them to know that we are going to work very hard to ensure that their school environment feels safe, feels positive, and feels inclusive. And that creating an environment for adopted children will help all children feel safe at school. And so we know that school-age children are really struggling to understand and integrate their adoption story. Things are being triggered that they're fielding questions and comments, and they need our help as parents. They need help from their educators to really negotiate all of this. So as I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the presentation, we have a number of publications, including a Safe at School manual that can be purchased and shared with educators that talks about many of the same themes that I've talked about today and goes a little bit more in depth into some of those issues and gives very concrete ways that the school community can really work towards being more inclusive, can be more sensitive to assignments, and all of those things. So it has some really good concrete tools for our educators. In addition, we have some other publications around helping children to deal with intrusive questions and comments. Our Wise Up program really helps kids feel empowered to be able to share their story and gives them very specific strategies for how to deal with, as I said, the comments or questions that they may get at school or at other places within the community. Also on our website, you can get links to our monthly live webinar series and also see our additional in-demand webinars that we have available. And we have resources and links for other resources. We have our case bibliography if you're looking for books for your own family or books that you want to share with educators that may give them some additional information about adoption. So you can find those resources yourselves. We also have resources for professionals and links there, so you can suggest that educators visit our website as well to get more information. So I thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this webinar today. I think school, as I said, continues to be such an important issue, and that comes up in the work I do with families all of the time. So I hope that today's presentation gave you some good things to think about, as well as some concrete strategies and tools for how you can work collaboratively with your child's school to really help address some of the issues that we discussed. If you need a certificate of attendance, please email your request to arrigo@adoptionsupport.org. And as I said before, please visit our website if you need any additional information. Thanks again for joining us.